So welcome everyone. My name is Joanne Geer and I'm the Executive Director for the Westchester Biotech Project. We're really looking forward to hearing on emerging technologies, synthetic biology, a revolution across all industries with my friend Karl Schmieder. Oops. There we go. And I want to introduce Chris Kinzel, who is our program coordinator. You've all probably received communications from him, and he'll take us forward. Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Joanne. Hi, my name's Chris. I'm the program coordinator here at the Westchester Biotech Project. Thanks for joining us today. If you're not familiar with us, we are a borderless initiative, and kind of our new slogan we're running with mapping the future for regional and international collaboration. Kind of what we really do is bring together disparate resources, this could be people, projects that might not have a chance to really meet and interact in their normal business and personal lives, and try to really start some engaging conversations, listen to ideas, and get some momentum as to how we can add value to the biotech community, support what's here, and help set up plans to expand infrastructure and collaborative efforts. You want to? So some of our larger programs, these are symposia. We have our Innovation and Research Symposia coming up. It's an annual come and share your work and bring the community together event. That will be spring of 2019, along with a rare disease symposium and a tauopathy colloquium, which is a kind of a new focus area that we're jumping into. We welcome you to explore our website. These events will be their planning stages right now for 2019. And one of the things that we really encourage is participation from our community and for people to get involved in our planning and our efforts. So a lot of our ideas really come from you. We really value that connection and communication. So here's some information. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube. Our archive, this session will be recorded and put on our YouTube along with the PDF. So we invite you to explore those resources. And like any organization, we are a nonprofit, and alone, it's really, you know, our value comes from these collaborative engagements with people that we've met in our region, in our community, and here's a couple of them. And really, without these connections, our value isn't realized. So we appreciate all of that interaction very much. Today we have Karl Schmieder with us. Really fascinating topic. So kind of, I'm a biochemist, so this is kind of my area. But this topic of synthetic biology, and until you really think about it, all the industries, synthetic biology, from textiles to materials to foods to clothing to everything in between. As we move forward in the future, we're really going to start to see a biological component to all of these industries that enhances innovation, and the impact is staggering. The potential to really improve everything across the board. Karl Schmieder, he's the founder of messagingLAB, which is a strategy and marketing agency focused on life science leaders. They help companies develop the strategies and tactics they need to grow and be competitive in today's advancing industries. He also teaches Fortune 500 companies, associations, and students how to develop a business strategy that leverages the power of biology, which he will dive into momentarily. I'll pass it over to you, Karl.
Okay, you guys can hear me, right? I just want to be sure I'm not, it's not dead air. Chris, can you just confirm?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay. So thanks, Joanne and Christopher, for the introduction. I'm super happy to be doing this presentation. This is a short version of either a 4-hour or 8-hour presentation that I do to teach people the fundamentals of synthetic biology. But I've also done a 15-minute or 20-minute or 30-minute version where I kind of narrow it down and kind of give people a high-level overview. And this should take us about less than 20 minutes for me to go through this, and then I'll open it up for questions. So as Christopher mentioned, I got to get the slides to work. Okay, as Christopher mentioned, I'm founder of messagingLAB, and I have a little bit of an unusual background in that I'm trained as a biochemist / molecular biologist, but I'm also a creative writer, and I've worked on the communications and strategy side of the biotech industry for the past 20 years. And in addition, I'm also a co-founder of an organization that's based here in New York City that's called New BioCity, and what we're doing is advocating both for the city and the state to understand that biotechnology isn't just healthcare. As you may know, or if you talk to people and you mention biotech, usually they will either go to ag and talk about GMOs, which are in general misunderstood, or they'll talk about healthcare and how healthcare is biotechnology. But there is this whole other world out there that is growing very quickly, and I'm going to touch upon that in this presentation. So I love biotech so much that I ended up writing a book about it. I wrote this book, I co-authored this book with John Cumbers. John Cumbers leads an organization called SynBioBeta that is one of the largest events for synthetic biology in the world. And we published this book exactly 1 year ago, and we've been out evangelizing for SynBio and this kind of new direction that biotech is taking. And we're very lucky to interview some of the people who are leading this industry in this book, and I'm going to talk about them during this presentation. But to kind of give you some context, I just want to remind you that biotechnology as an industry is still relatively young. Here's Herb Boyer, co-founder of Genentech. I remember this Time magazine cover. I was a kid when it came out, and I think that reading about this, as well as all the science fiction I was consuming at the time, really drove me to say, I don't know what this is, but this is going to be a part of my life. And I ended up making that the focus of my academic career. And then now, here I am 20-something years later, and very involved in biotech and enamored and more enthusiastic and optimistic about it than I ever have been. I feel like where we are getting now is kind of where I envisioned it would be back when I was a teenager, but I also know we have a long way to go and things are moving very quickly. So for example, this week, the big news was these CRISPR gene-edited babies that happen in China, which just kind of shows how quickly this technology is moving. And there was, a well-deserved uproar about the ethics and regulatory, oversight of this event. But we're just at the beginning. I mean, CRISPR as a technology is less than 10 years old, and it's so powerful, and it's being used across biotech and the life sciences to really kind of get to know how biology is working. So if we think about biotech, the industry as just being 40 years old, and we compare it to other industries, it's surprising that it already touches most of our lives in some way every day, whether it's the foods that you consume that have been genetically modified to decrease the amount of pesticides that are being used, or if it's the jeans you're wearing that are softened with enzymes that have been genetically modified, or even carpet on your car that is a product of synthetic biology that has been engineered to be more resilient. These are just some of the examples that we see and touch us in our lives every single day. And what most people don't know is that biotech as a whole makes up just under 3% of the US economy. And that means that it's slightly less than agriculture, but it's more than construction and mining. And it's a mere $370 to $400 billion. And I've heard people say people will not be paying attention to this industry until it's $1 billion industry. I'm not sure I agree with that. I don't want to agree with that because I think that what we're doing is changing the world for the better. But that's kind of the way things break out. And this, slide from Bioeconomy Capital came out at the beginning of the year, and they update this on a regular basis. But again, people don't realize that biotech is a part of their lives, and they also don't realize that it's only 40 years old. And if we were to compare it to other industries, we would see that we're still at the very early stages. So if we were to compare it to the aviation industry, we'd still be in the prop plane. We haven't even gotten to jets. That happens a decade later. And we definitely haven't gotten to be able to design an airplane on a computer, which is what Boeing did with their 777 or 787. They designed the entire thing on a computer, and they had a real good understanding of what they were going to have before they even built it. And we can't do that with biology yet, but we're getting there. If we were to look at it, another industry, the computer industry, an industry that touches our lives, and we were to look at where it was 40 years in, we would just be at the PC stage. And this is, in the early 80s, late 70s, where Apple is introducing its Apple II, and the Macintosh hasn't even been introduced. I think that happens in the mid 80s. And the amount of memory that these machines had is, what you carry around in your pocket, in your smartphone, is probably 1,000 or 1,000,000 times better than these machines were in their day. So I just make that point to just kind of show you that where we are in biotech, as sophisticated as we are, is still relatively early. But that said, people are looking at the industry. And last year, at the beginning of last year, Entrepreneur Magazine printed this article saying that synthetic biology was one of the best industries to start a business in. But most people don't even know what synthetic biology is. So it was kind of funny, at least to me and the other people who are in paying attention to synthetic biology, to see this, because it's still kind of an obscure small industry. And what makes synthetic biology possible is that we've gotten really good at reading and writing DNA. And both of these things have gotten really cheap. So on the reading side, we've gone from a $3 billion cost to sequence the first human genome to $100 or $1,000. And I know Veritas Genomics was offering $200 genome reads a couple weeks ago as a special. And at Harvard, Professor George Church, who's a co-founder or advisor to dozens of biotech companies, has a company called Nebula Genomics that will sequence your genome for free, with the understanding that if they find anything interesting there, you will share in the profits, which is a really interesting model. And people had been predicting that this would happen for 10 years, and here we are. We're at the point where sequencing a genome essentially can be done, costless. At the same time, on the other side of it, we've gotten really good at printing DNA. And those two things together, and the ability to do them inexpensively, as shown by the prices decreasing in this curve, means that you are able to read what nature is doing out in the environment. And we could argue that nature is the most sophisticated builder on the planet, since nature did build the planet. And a plant on your desk is a much more complicated piece of technology than that computer sitting next to it. Being able to go out and look at the way nature operates and take the tools that nature has given us on the sequencing side, but then being able to reproduce that and printing DNA very inexpensively means that you can conduct a lot more experiments quicker. The other thing is that this ability to read and write DNA has been called analogous to what Gutenberg did to the printing press. And I think I agree with this. This guy, Richard Kitney, he runs Symbicity in the UK. The UK has a very robust blueprint for incorporating biotech into their economy. And I agree with him. This ability to read and write is analogous to what Gutenberg did, but it's going to be much more profound. And as I said earlier, we're still at the beginning of this. So it's getting cheaper. We can read DNA cheaply, we can write it cheaply, and we can digitize it. And digitizing allows us to do all the great things that we're able to do with digital technologies, make things more efficient, do a lot of experiments, try new things out in ways that we weren't able to do before. And so that brings us to the idea of what synthetic biology is. And synthetic biology is the idea of making biology easier to engineer. And the reason we say that is because once you're able to engineer things, I'm going to skip a slide here. We're able to make things much more predictable. We can measure them. We can make them much more repeatable. We can increase the number of applications. And in my picture, I show some of the things that we've engineered that have made a big difference in our lives. The microchip is probably the most complicated thing that humans have engineered to date. Again, it pales in comparison to a plant or a chicken, which is even more complicated. But at the same time, you know, we've built all these bridges, we've built these roads. We were pretty good at this stuff. And, you know, we've sent man into space, we've got the space station. But again, biology is still much more complicated, and being able to engineer it means that we're going to get a handle on it, and that means that we're going to open the floodgates for applications. One of the things I tell people who don't know anything about the space, I say, look, this is kind of like where we were with the internet. If you think back to the late 90s, early 2000s, when the internet just started, you had to understand HTML, and that's what it took for you to, you know, create a website. And websites were very static. They were, you know, kind of more brochureware. And I won't say that biotech today is brochureware, but we, you know, especially given how much economic value the industry creates. But what we're going to see as it becomes easier to engineer, becomes much more predictable, is really a kind of Cambrian explosion of creativity applied to biotech. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some examples of some of the companies and the things that are being done out there. Here's a chart that shows through a couple of years ago the number of startups and the amount of investment in the space. And as of October of 2018, money pouring into the synthetic biology space reached almost $2 billion. And that might not sound like a lot when you compare it to biotech in general, because biotech in 2018 has seen about 10 billion poured into it. And it's definitely not as much as, for example, the cannabis industry, which has had more than $1.2 billion poured into it. But, you know, this is an industry that's still relatively young, and its impact is just now starting to be felt. You'll see that in the upper right-hand corner, there's a couple of Modernas up on the top. And Moderna, the biotech company based in Boston, that is also a synthetic biology company, or is using synthetic biology techniques to make medicines, announced that they're going to go public, and it's going to be one of the biggest biotech IPOs, if not the biggest IPO ever in history. You know, another company that's on here, you probably look around a little bit, I'll talk about them a bit, that just went public is a company called Twist Biosciences, and they specialize in DNA synthesis. So again, it shows that the public markets have an appetite for these companies, and there's a lot of activity going on. Applications, as Christopher mentioned in the introduction, they're all over the place. And for me, what I find exciting is the fact that people are looking at synthetic biology and trying to figure out ways that they can apply it to their own business. And I get very excited about going into a business that normally wouldn't be someone who'd be talking about biotech, but wants to hear about this and talk about how this might be a tool for innovation. So let me talk about some of the kinds of companies that are in the space and the impact that they're already having. There's a kind of a sub-industry that is growing out of synthetic biology, which is organism engineering. And the idea is that if you decide that you want to do something using biology, you would start with an organism, whether that is yeast or E. coli. That organism can be customized to do the work that you want it to. And the thinking is that in the future, any kind of process, whether it's manufacturing or sensor creation, will probably have an organism behind it. And the companies that are doing this, most notably Ginkgo Bioworks in Boston, are the companies that you're going to go to. They want to be something like the Intel Inside, designing the organisms, and then you as the end user would deploy it. The other part of this is that engineering and optimization of organisms is getting much more sophisticated. So you've got companies, in addition to Asimov, in addition to Ginkgo, you have companies like Asimov and Cell Design Labs that are actually programming behaviors into cells. So if you can think of someone doing bioprocessing, a company is processing, you know, tens of thousands of liters of product every day to extract very valuable protein. If you're able to optimize that by tweaking your organism so it behaves differently based on where it is in the process, you can actually get more product. And some of those runs with those in bioprocessing are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. So if you're able to get a few more percentage optimization out of your production organism, it's that much more money in your pocket. On the kind of more consumer end of this, you've got companies that are looking at how do you use biology to fabricate things. So in New York City, they actually just moved to New Jersey into Nutley, where Roche used to be, but they kept their design studio here in Brooklyn, is a company called Modern Meadow, and Modern Meadow specializes in printing leather. So the idea is that cows are one of the biggest polluters, or livestock. You know, feedlots are one of the biggest polluters on the planet. And if you're able to take the cow out of leather production, all of a sudden you have the ability to print leather, and you can do something that is much more sustainable and no longer dependent on those feedlots. In addition, on the very left-hand side of the slide, I'm showing spider silk, which is brewed by a number of companies around the world. There's 3 that I know of, one in Japan, one in Germany, and then in San Francisco, there's a company called Bolt Threads. And what's interesting about Bolt is they signed a deal a couple years ago with Patagonia. Patagonia, the sportswear maker, is a vehemently anti-GMO company, but they signed a deal with them. And when I asked the CEO of Bolt, how did you guys do that? And he said, well, Patagonia is a company that is very willing to be educated. And when we pointed out the places in their supply chain where they would not be able to get rid of petroleum products, all of a sudden they became very interested in what we would be able to do for them. And Bolt has only released products on very limited runs at this point. They're still kind of in a testing mode. But every time they release a product, it gets sold out. They've released neckties, handbags that are made out of a synthetic leather, a different kind of synthetic leather that I'll talk about in a minute. They've also done collaborations with wool manufacturers. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how the spider silk is put into things like sneakers and Patagonia and and other consumer products. Another area where synthetic biology is being used is in hardware manufacturing. So I've got a couple of examples here. The big robot in the middle is an Opentron's laboratory pipetting robot. This is actually a Brooklyn-based company that sells these robots and also has an open protocol library. They've been incredibly successful and are a nice asset to the city in that they've grown from just a couple people to over 80. And the CEO just told me that they're about to grow double that size over the course of the next year. So high growth. And one of the things that I didn't mention earlier is that the value that is created in biotech, I've read this in a couple places, you can create more value with fewer people than you can in other industries, which is also something that's very interesting to me, because you can have a couple people that get together, work on a laptop, and create $1 billion product, a molecule that could be a medicine, or it could be something that is biological in nature, but it doesn't take that many people, and it's going to get easier and easier. So some of the other hardware companies that are considered to be synthetic biology companies are Bento Lab, which is on the extreme left. They have a laptop-sized lab that they've been manufacturing in the UK, and they've been selling for probably around $500. That little lab has been bought by breweries, by people in agriculture, and they're using it to do tests. In addition, you've got the kind of miniaturization of DNA sequencing equipment, the Minion. It's out there, it's being used around the world in different places to sequence. And again, growing the library of information that we have about what nature has available to us. And then finally, on the extreme right, is a desktop DNA synthesizer. And there's actually been a lot of activity in the DNA synthesis space, and a real move to kind of shrinking the DNA synthesizers and making them much more inexpensive, which means making DNA synthesis much more accessible to people. What I didn't include in this presentation was a slide that looked at some of the software companies that are in this space, companies that are making it easier to design organisms, and that kind of work is also proceeding at a very rapid pace. Another area where synthetic biology is being applied is this whole area of cellular agriculture, where people are looking for new ways to grow food, decoupling food production from animals, making it available and much more sustainable. And this is actually something that one of the companies, or I shouldn't say companies because it's a nonprofit, there's a New York City-based company called New Harvest that has been funding the research and funding some of the startups in this space. And many of these companies have moved to the West Coast because there's kind of a different ecosystem out there. But some of the funding that is poured into the space has been very large, and the Gates Foundation and Bill Gates have been pouring money into the space very aggressively. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that a lot of the applications that are being looked at from a synthetic biology point of view are how do we better live with nature and use the resources that we have on top of the earth instead of extracting oil and creating petroleum products, which are not necessarily healthy for the earth. And what can we do to use synthetic biology to maybe help heal the planet and help with this coming climate change crisis that we have. So Mango Materials is a San Francisco-based company that takes methane from any source. It could be a feedlot, it could be a factory, and turns it into a very sustainable plastic. And on the right is a company called Ecovative. They're in upstate New York, outside of Albany, and they actually make packaging materials and building materials for out of mycelium. And there's an entire industry of companies that are using natural products for biofabrication. And Ecovative has worked with Bolt Threads on creating a different form of mycelium-based leather. And earlier this year, they put that on the market and they sold out of the 500 or 1,000 that they put on the market in just a couple of hours. So we were lucky enough to get Craig Venter in our book. And Craig says that over the next 20 years, he believes that this idea of synthetic biology is going to be the way that we manufacture things. And for me, I find that to be really exciting because what it means is, I'm going to skip the slide, that we're really kind of moving ourselves into the next industrial revolution where DNA synthesis and the engineering of biology is really driving manufacturing in a much more sustainable way. And as I said at the beginning, we really just are at the beginning of this. Biotech is only 40 years old, and so the next 40 years are really going to be fascinating in terms of the applications that we see. I just want to mention that when we go out, or when I go out and I teach this to people who have no idea, I also have this canvas that we created after we wrote the book, which is a useful exercise to go through if you have a product or a problem in manufacturing and you want to figure out how you might be able to use biology to solve that problem. And when we've gone out to do this with non-biotech companies, it actually becomes a very interesting exercise to kind of help them see what the possibilities are. And we find that people have been very appreciative of this. So thank you so much for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions. Like I said, I love giving this presentation, and I love teaching this to people who don't really know where or how biotech might fit into their manufacturing, or even if it could be a tool for the work that they do. Thank you.
Thank you, Karl. I want to encourage everyone, we have a nice intimate group today. So if you just sort of give me a wink in the chat room that you'd like to talk, I'll call upon you. I may call upon you anyway. I see a couple of names I know here on the call today. Chris, would you like to start? Did you have some questions you'd like to?
Yeah, thanks so much, Karl. Yeah, there was one that kind of jumped out at me right away. So as someone with a strong biochemistry and genetics background, it's really, really easy for me to agree with all of your statements that this is really revolutionary and it's kind of going to change the way we do everything. But one of the things that I think about is what's the public perception? How easily is this permeating, or are there misconceptions, or so it seems like the public support is something that's going to be required along this process. So wondering if you've run into that issue.
I haven't run into it personally, but I know it's out there, and well, I shouldn't say that. I do run into it on occasion where people are like, why do we need to toy with nature? I think that it merits a vigorous debate. I mean, I think we're seeing that play out in this whole CRISPR baby issue right now. There is a need for regulatory oversight, but I think the biggest thing that we need to do as a community is just help people understand what these technologies do and what they're capable of doing, and how they have the potential to make things better. The EU has some very restrictive rules against genetic engineering, and they've also recently added some very restrictive rules against CRISPR. And I understand, in many ways where they're coming from, but because of those rules, a lot of people don't have access to the technologies. And for example, I'm thinking of many African nations that don't do any plantings with genetically modified seeds only because they're following the EU regulations. And it's unfortunate because a lot of the seeds that have been modified could potentially help the people that are in those places where the seeds they're using don't really work. So I think it's important for there to be a lot of debate around this stuff. And I think that, for me, the more that people are educated and the more people understand, then, they can make hopefully rational and not emotional decisions about it. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of the way I think about it.
Right.
This is great.
Yeah, great.
David has some questions. David, would you like to unmute yourself? And then Louise, I'll read your question after that. Thank you for your note.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
We can. Hello, would you introduce yourself first?
Hi, I'm David McCarthy, Kingston, New York, and I met Joanne at the recent HV event.
Yeah, welcome.
Yeah, and Karl, thank you very much. Very informative. I'm one of the reasons that I joined today was that I helped start the local currency for our region, the Hudson Valley Current, and it looks like we're in the planning stages to actually be managing an investment fund that's going to be targeted to regenerative local investment for the Hudson Valley region. And I'm just very, very interested in all the different possibilities. I'm very pro-technology myself, although I could also be characterized as an environmentalist, definitely. But so my interests in all this relate to things like, well, first of all, global warming, global climate change solutions. Very, very important. I recently got very inspired by the drawdown project that Paul Hawken is doing. Do you guys know about that?
Yeah, I did. I actually read the book just like a week ago.
It's so wonderful. Every one of those things really gives humanity a lot of hope, and it's a lot of business opportunities. I can see both sides of it. I can see the business opportunities and just the hope for the future that so many people are not feeling right now. And so, I really think there's a lot of potential in all this for things like literally finding ways to draw carbon down through plant biology. Also very interested in recycling type issues, plastics that don't destroy the oceans. We have a bit of a recycling problem up here right now that I'm thinking that maybe a business opportunity would be for local recycling rather than sending it to China. China is actually refusing our recyclables. I don't know if you've been keeping up on that.
Thank you, David. Yeah. That's a really interesting contributions. Let's come back to that. We have a little different perspective from Louisa, and then if you have a question for Karl, then we certainly would love to come back to, because what I wrote down myself was when Karl said that we could use this synthetic biology to heal the earth. So I would like to hear lots more. But
I just want to, before you ask
Yeah.
Louise's question, I just want to make a comment. David, I'd love to talk to you some more, because when I talk, through New BioCity, we recently had a meeting with the EDC, the Economic Development Council of New York City. And I often will start talking to, the two directions I often start when I talk about biotech is, one is microbrewing, because that's been an incredibly successful industry, and it basically is a biotech industry thing. And then and I'll also talk about the waste issue, because there's a lot of opportunities with all the organic and non-organic waste, And I think we miss the opportunity, and waste is a gold mine. You know, it's biomass that can be used to feed organisms that can do, you know, positive things for us. So I'd love to talk to you more, you know, David, and kind of get what you guys are thinking and tell you some of the stuff I'm seeing as well. Go ahead, Joanne, sorry.
Well, that's okay. And in fact, let's ask Louise's question and then we can continue on, because I think you're certainly talking about something of universal interest. So Louise is on a train, so she can't speak, but here's her question. She's curious what you think may be the impact of synthetic biology on clinical development. Will some trials on humans no longer be necessary in the future, potentially, for example?
So I didn't mention this, but I'm glad you asked that question, Louisa, because half my business has always been in the clinical trial space. And so I'm going to just say for the last 15 years, I've advised companies that are designing trials and working with the pharmaceutical industry and helping them understand how do you conduct trials more efficiently. So your question is, will synthetic biology enable drug development to happen without necessarily having human trials? I think yes and no. There's a lot of interesting things happening. For example, the whole lab on a chip or body on a chip, you know, project that's being funded by DARPA. And I think a lot of that will enable drug development to happen a lot faster. But I don't think we're never going to get rid of the human component of it. I think what it'll do is it'll allow us to get, hopefully it'll allow us to get more hits, more better hits. But I think what we'll see on the trial evolution side is much more, we're seeing this trend already, and I think it's early days, much more virtual or hybrid trials, so that more people can participate without necessarily having to undergo the burden of needing to drive, you know, an hour, 2 hours to be able to get to a clinical site. Because right now, today, only 2 or 3% of the entire population participates in trials. And I've heard it said that it's not because, you know, the trials are necessarily bad, but it's more that the requirements are not easy to comply with, and also the fact that you have to go to a place, you know, every day or every week or every month, whatever the frequency might be, really impacts people. And so we are getting to a place where wearables and at-home nurses and techs can come in and, you know, help drive a trial that way. And I think what that's going to do is really going to explode the number of people that participate and potentially explode the number of trials that are conducted. Synthetic biology's impact is going to be on the earlier side in terms of, you know, testing potential drugs, and then also on the idea of creating living medicines, which could be bacteria or some organism that you ingest or lives on your skin or something, but only acts when an illness happens or when it might need to attack, you know, something that's in your body. Hopefully that's not too long of a complicated answer. Convoluted answer.
Well, thank you. No, I appreciate that, and it's a great question. And I think that while everybody is grappling with what does this mean, certainly our industry is right along with everyone else. Let's see. I just want to invite Deborah Novick, whether you have a comment or question, but I'll just invite you to go ahead and introduce yourself. This group should know who you are and what you do.
Thank you, Joanne. Hi, everyone. I'm Deborah Novick, and I am the director of BioInc, a life sciences incubator attached to New York Medical College. And Karl and I actually know each other for quite a long time in a different version of my life. Before coming here, I did a lot of small business consulting, and Karl and I had occasion to work together in that version of my life. And I read Karl's book before I came to work here in January. So it's really great, Karl, to be together today and to hear your presentation. I'm so fascinated by all these developments. And I think the only thing I would say is reiterating something you said. I think most people have no idea. They hear about biotech. They know about, you know, a little bit about the new kinds of medicines that are being developed, or the new kinds of medical treatments like precision medicine and immunotherapies, the body healing itself. But my hunch is that the majority of people have no idea how many different sectors are being touched by all this deeper understanding of how biology can be put to use in an engineering capacity or in other parts of life. So I guess if I were going to formulate a question, it would be sort of, how do you see that information getting out there? What can we all do to help people be aware of these exciting developments?
Oh, you know, I mean, I don't know how to answer what should we all do. I think that being informed and being enthusiastic about what we're doing goes a really long way. I think that there are efforts underway to, you know, kind of get more of this into the schools, which I think is really important for us to advocate for, and to get it into the schools at younger ages. And we're lucky. I live in Brooklyn. We've got 2 community labs here. There's community labs all over the country. They basically operate on a gym model. They do classes. They try to engage their communities. I think that those efforts are really super important. Now, I think what will happen, and I think it's going to happen pretty quickly, is that there's going to be consumer products that will have a biotech story attached to them. So I talked about Patagonia. A couple years ago, Adidas announced a spider silk shoe at the Biofabricate conference. And that kind of didn't go anywhere. Everybody got kind of excited about it. But once those kinds of products start making it onto the market, I mean, Target, for example, in some markets has an entire row dedicated to plant-based protein or non-traditional, you know, animal proteins. So once we start to get, you know, these products that have a biotech story associated with them, then I think we're going to see a lot more of this in the mainstream, and I think that's going to come pretty quick.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, thank you, Joanne, for giving me a minute to chat with Karl, and I'll just yield the floor in case other people have.
Well, thank you. And I already wrote some notes about things we should talk about for next year, Deborah. I think maybe this is something that we can help our fellow citizens. Let's see. And there's is it Dr. I think they might have left. Okay, good. So I'm Karl. I'm going to ask you the question then to talk about waste. And if you can talk about what's going on in terms of addressing waste, you know, across all the different sectors, you know, obviously with beer, you know, I actually am familiar with sometimes what happens with that good stuff, but across any of the categories that you have any knowledge.
So I'll talk about two things, and they're not necessarily synthetic biology focused, but they could be. So, for example, beer generates a lot of organic waste, and I've got a friend who's got a company called Affineur, and they take that waste and they ferment it and turn it back into something that is a nutritionally viable product. And so I'm thinking about like the barley and the hops and all of the kind of solids that get used to making beer. Once the beer is brewed, all that gets disposed of, and Affineur takes that and turns it into a usable product. Another thing that I've been paying a fair amount of attention to is the use of insects as a protein source. And there's a number of people who are using black fly larvae, which is a very versatile insect. And they will take the organic waste and they end up with 2 products at the end. You inoculate the waste with black fly larvae. The black flies consume it, and the larvae grow bigger, but they also produce a very rich compost. And as the larvae grow bigger, those end up being a protein source that can be used to feed fish in aquaculture. So you may not know this, but for aquaculture, for every kilogram of fish we harvest and eat, they use 2.5 kilograms of fish to feed those fish. So we are looking for ways to stop that, because that's not a very sustainable way to do aquaculture. And one of the ways is you've got this insect industry that is growing up. And I've been talking to a couple of people who are starting these kinds of companies, one in New Jersey and one here in New York. And David, this could actually be something that's interesting for you up in the Hudson Valley, because it's, you know, one of the things we're not necessarily thinking about, and it might not be as sophisticated as what we could do with biotech or synthetic biology, but it's a very viable and interesting way to produce two products with one, biological system. The other thing, like I mentioned, is like what Mango Materials is doing, where they're looking for waste products that they can run through a number of organisms and end up with a useful product at the end. They happen to work with methane and methanotropes, and they end up with this, sustainable plastic. And I know they're not the only ones that are doing that. But yeah, the waste thing is a huge issue, and I think there's a ton of opportunities there.
I think.
Joanne, can I ask one more question of Karl?
Sure, and then I think Chris has a question.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's
Karl, you mentioned, I was writing notes as you were giving your presentation of different organizations that are involved or that are publishing about it. I wrote down Bioeconomy Capital, and you mentioned the article that was either in Inc. magazine or Entrepreneur magazine. But for those of us that want to get more knowledgeable, what other either publications or websites or organizations do you keep track of that you could share with us as good resources?
Okay, absolutely. So besides my book, I recommend Rob Carlson's book, Biology is Technology, which at this point is, I would say 7 years old, but I know it's actually a fair amount older than that because he had actually finished writing it in 2008. And that gives you a really good overview of kind of the history and, where this industry came from. There's a number of publications that I follow. On the commercial side, I like to follow the biotech industry organization's industrial newsletter. So that's kind of more on the biofuels side of the world. And then there's an organization called Biofuels Digest is another one that I subscribe to, and they kind of cover the entire space. And then John Cumbers, my co-author, puts out a weekly newsletter. And if you go to symbiobeta.com, that's a great place to subscribe to that.
Karl, I'm going to ask you to send us those links, and we'll put them right. Bless you. We'll put them right on the landing page.
Okay, I will do that.
Thanks very much. We'll do a little blog post and let people know about the recording after that'll go out in about a week or so we can do that. Let's see. So, Chris, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. So sorry if this is kind of abstract or maybe hard to answer, but maybe it's more of your opinion. Where do you see kind of this new revolution, which industries that it's going to permeate the easiest, the soonest, and other industries that might have some pushback that might take a little bit longer? I'm thinking maybe the foods and textiles might be kind of quick, but what's your opinion on kind of that outlook?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, Chris. And I think, it's pharma, is the low-hanging fruit, I think, because pharma basically depends on biotech for its pipeline and for its manufacturing, and synthetic biology, applying engineering to biology is going to make that, much more efficient. And like to Louise's point, just allow us to create more ways of targeting diseases and better ways to process, medicines or bioprocess medicines. I think I agree with you. Materials are a big one. Consumer products are also a big one. P&G is a huge sponsor in this space. They're partners with IndieBio. IndieBio is the biggest incubator for early stage biotech companies. Historically, they've been in Ireland and San Francisco, but now they're moving to New York City. And they're here on the ground getting themselves ready for their first class, which I think is going to be announced in April of 2019. And we're super excited about that. But so, yeah, biomaterials, materials and food are going to be big ones. I think where it's less clear, or it might take longer, or these things are all unpredictable, are things like the energy sector. I know that there's companies talking about using biological batteries or creating biological batteries. There's a number of companies working on using DNA as a storage device, and that space is moving really quickly. And it kind of needs to, because all of the media that we have for storage are not moving fast enough, And the people who are archivists and are responsible for archiving huge amounts of data, they can't, the amount of data we're generating can't keep up with, you know, the tape drives and the hard drives. And so they're looking for new ways to do this. And DNA is, you know, it's gone from, you know, 64 kilobytes to over a terabyte in less than 2 years. So that, I think, is going to move pretty quickly.
Karl, can you talk about how that works?
I don't really, I mean, I wish I could say that I understood it intimately. I don't. I think it doesn't move as quickly as a normal hard drive does, but the permanence is there in terms of like the reading of you know, data and turning it into DNA.
Wow.
And the interest is there because there's been a fair amount of investment in that space. And if you're really interested in it, and I'll send this in the link. This company, Catalog DNA, which is one of the leaders in that space, just put out a video, which I thought was a great explanation and a lot of fun to watch.
Oh, thank you. That'd be great. David, I want to give you another opportunity. Would you like to ask a further question?
Karl, just wondering where your thoughts are on biofuels nowadays. I noticed you talked about reading Biofuels Digest, which has been one of my favorites over the years. And I haven't been following that space a lot in the last year or two, but I know that there's a lot of genetically modified organisms that are used to basically ferment things like butanol. And where do you see some of that innovations coming in that area?
I mean, so you know, if you followed Biofuels Digest, you know that the challenge was that oil got really cheap, and and creating biofuels was still relatively expensive, especially producing them at scale. But I think, and then there's this other problem that we have, in that our government continues to subsidize things that we probably have outgrown, and they don't put enough money into kind of future technologies that we know are potentially going to be beneficial for the planet and create jobs economically, are good for you know, the economy, which I think is what was really interesting about reading Drawdown, and what I feel is often missing from the climate change discussion is just what it you know, like the report that came out a couple weeks ago talked about the impact on the economy from a negative point of view, but it didn't talk about what opportunity climate change offers economically. And I think the economic opportunity is tremendous. But I think that we will continue to see a lot of innovation and some very rapid advancements in that field. So one of the early companies, Amyris, is a partner of Ginkgo Bioworks. Ginkgo is the organism engineering company that I mentioned. Ginkgo has gotten incredibly good at engineering organisms. They do it very inexpensively, and the production gains that they're you know, delivering for their clients are incredible. And so as more people start to understand that you can order an organism, I think that to produce something, producing biofuels will get cheaper. Will it compete with oil? I think there will be a point at which it will. I'm not sure we're there today.
Thank you. Thank you, Karl.
Thanks for the question. I appreciate it. I'd love to talk to you more about what you're doing.
Yeah, I think this conversation has really opened up some additional really interesting thoughts, and I'm really glad, David, that you're here with us today, and this Hudson Valley Venture Network that's growing is really it's a great community, and it includes the universities and all the different co-working spaces and incubators and so on. And our last meeting was up in Rhinebeck. That was really lovely. So and the picture on your slide here makes me feel very Adirondack. So it's
it's wonderful. Thank you so much to all of you. I really learned a lot today, and I want to keep the conversation going.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Karl. Do you have any final comments? Anything we want to make sure that we all hear before we part?
No, I really, you know, thank you for inviting me, and thank you everyone for your questions and for participating. I super appreciate it. Hope you have a great holiday.